I'm honored to be here. I'm Alicia Seiger. I'm the Managing Director of the Sustainable Finance Initiative at Stanford, which is out of the Precourt Institute. I also run the Steyer-Taylor Center for Energy Policy and Finance, which is a joint initiative of the Business School and the Law School, and I lecture at the Law School. I'm just going to set the stage for our great panelists here with a few framing comments. They're each going to talk for about 8 minutes, giving a presentation, then we'll get into some Q&A, moderated and then unmoderated with your questions. So the three things I'm just going to do right here now are, one, to define planetary health, to talk about how planetary health intersects with the private sector, and then just preview in categories 4 different types of interventions that demonstrate how the private sector is driving change in planetary health. So first, what is planetary health? I find in these conversations people are defining the universe differently, so I find it helpful to actually lay that out. In my world, it's climate change. There's another definition which I think is worth talking about too, which is the Sustainable Development Goals. So really 2 thermostats, they're interrelated, but some people think of them one or the other as their North Star. With regard to climate change, just thinking about what planetary health means in that context, as you well know, in December of 2015, 195 countries agreed to limit warming to less than 2 degrees Celsius. In just last year, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change issued a report on the impacts and emissions pathways to 1.5 degrees C, which was that aspiration of the Paris Agreement. And we see that there are significant implications for human health, livelihoods, food security, water supply, human security, and economic growth. Big deltas between 1.5 and 2 degrees, so it seems like half a degree. What's the difference? There are really tremendous implications. The model pathways to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius mean that we need to achieve global net emissions, that global net emissions need to decline by 45% by 2030 and reach net zero by 2050. Switching now to another North Star people think about are the UN Sustainable Development Goals. These were designed as a blueprint for peace and prosperity for people on the planet. Goals were to end poverty, improve health and education, reduce inequality, and spur economic growth. I think of these, again, as interrelated. Many of the Sustainable Development Goals are directly tied to climate. Our panelists may refer to either of these North Stars. I'm going to frame the next set of comments in the context of climate change, because in my view, climate change is the ultimate threat amplifier to the Sustainable Development Goals and anything else you might consider relevant to planetary health. So, how does planetary health intersect the private sector? Well, there are risks and there are opportunities. On the risks side, there's different ways of thinking about that. There's the economic value at risk. So according to this most recent IPCC 1.5 degrees C report, at 1.5 degrees Celsius, if we limit warming to that, we're still going to inflict up to $54 trillion of damage to the global economy by 2100. At 2 degrees, that number is projected to be 69 trillion in damages in the same period. Businesses and investors are increasingly aware of the physical and transition risks climate presents to their assets and operations. Employees are increasingly waking up to the risks of climate change and demanding more from their companies. Just this past May, 8,000 Amazon employees filed a shareholder resolution asking the company to create a comprehensive climate change plan. Investors are facing pressure to divest of fossil fuel holdings, and attribution science has made climate liability lawsuits a credible threat to the fossil fuel industry. But it's not just sticks, there are also carrots. So there's tremendous opportunity for wealth creation and competitive advantage by capitalizing on the transition to a low-carbon, climate-resilient economy. That can be done through new technologies, new business models, resource efficiency, leading to sustainable outperformance, and as a result of a shifting policy landscape. So the good news is our panelists, you can't see it, but they are all holding carrots. So we've got 4 leaders here that represent different types of innovation in the private sector that all drive towards better planetary health. First category is this idea of that is rapidly gaining momentum around sustainable capitalism and redefining the role of the corporation. 2 recent examples. Last month, 181 CEOs, all members of the Business Roundtable, a club of large company CEOs, released a statement redefining the purpose of a corporation beyond Milton Friedman's definition of maximizing shareholder value to one that considers the benefit of all stakeholders, including customers, employees, suppliers, and communities. This is unrelated to climate, but it just shows the next example, but it just shows what companies can do. Walmart just this week announced it would stop selling handguns and ammunition and no longer supports open carry in its stores. Yeah. The second category is natural resource accounting. This is the idea of moving beyond just pricing externalities to fully accounting for the value of ecosystems, goods, and services. We're going to hear more about that in a minute. Another category is transforming economic systems through the lens of resource efficiency. We're going to hear about this in the case of Impossible Foods by feeding more people in a way that dramatically reduces greenhouse gas emissions as well as land and water use. And finally, there's a category called evolving finance to better account for risks and opportunities previously understood to be immaterial or non-market. This, is encompassed in the proliferation of products around low carbon and transition-ready portfolios. You see it in the rise of ESG and impact investing, which is now by one measure up to $30 trillion under management. So with that, let me introduce our panel. So Robert Strand, who's going to raise his hand. Robert is the executive director for responsible business at the Haas School of Business at Berkeley. We will allow him to be here, welcome him despite his colors. He's an expert on the concept of sustainable capitalism. The title of his in-progress book is Sustainable Vikings, Nordic Leadership in Sustainable Capitalism, in which he explores how the Nordics are achieving comparatively strong performances in the Sustainable Development Goals and what lessons we may draw here in the US. Gretchen Daly, on the far side, is an ecologist by training and winner of the Blue Planet Prize. She co-founded the Natural Capital Project, which is pioneering a systematic approach to valuing nature in policy, finance, and management. NatCap's data and software are now used in 185 countries worldwide. That is truly impressive. Her team's most recent book is coming out officially today, Green Growth That Works, Natural Capital Policy and Finance Mechanisms Around the World. Ranjini Vardhan is the VP of our Research and Development at Impossible Foods, a Redwood City-based startup that aims to create delicious plant-based meat products for a more sustainable food system. As a scientist, Ranjini felt compelled to find ways to develop plant-based meats and revolutionize meat production systems. She joined the company in 2011 and currently leads their R&D efforts aimed at understanding how plant-based ingredients can be used to create a variety of textures and flavors for the next generation of Impossible products. And finally, John Fullerton from the Capital Institute. John is a recognized leader on the future of capitalism and finance. He's a former banker turned impact investor focused on food and land issues, a systems thinker, and some have said a philosopher. John is the author of Regenerative Capitalism, How Universal Principles and Patterns Will Shape the New Economy, and Finance for a Regenerative World. He's going to talk to us about the purpose of the corporation in the context of transforming to a regenerative economy that nurtures human and planetary well-being, and in particular, the responsibility of finance. He is also a member of the Club of Rome. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Robert, whose slides are going to play.
Thank you very much. I am Robert Strand, indeed, and let's see if I can get a slide to roll here. Oh, there it is. There it is. This morning, I have a 5-year-old and a 3-year-old, Mikkel and Jonas, and this morning at the breakfast table, Mikkel said, "What are you doing today, Dada?" And I said, "I'm going to Stanford." And do you know what Mikkel said to me? Stanford. It's exactly what he said. But then he paused, and a little bit later in breakfast, he said, "You know what, Dad, I think you should go to Stanford because maybe you could help them." So, with that, then I am helping myself here by bringing a little bit of Berkeley down here to Stanford. This is our most iconic imagery that we have at the great University of California, Berkeley. On the right, we have the Sather Tower, and on the left, we have the Sather Gate. And they are symbols of the University of California, Berkeley. They're also symbols of the Nordics. Peter Sather founded the Bank of California back in the gold rush era, gave the land that was to become the University of California, Berkeley, and he was a Norwegian. We have deep Nordic roots at the University of California, Berkeley, and I draw upon that legacy and celebrate it and use it to look forward. And it's very relevant when it comes to issues of sustainability and sustainable development. Now, the Sustainable Development Goals were mentioned, and I should walk back a few years. The very definition of sustainable development, it also comes to us with a heavy hand from the Nordics. Of course, at 1987, Our Common Future, former Norwegian Prime Minister Gro Harlem Brundtland was the head of that commission that defined sustainable development as development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And more recently, 2015, of course, the Sustainable Development Goals were launched. 17 goals, number 13, of course, being climate action that encompass our greatest challenges that we face on this planet. And the economist Jeffrey Sachs and team do an annual measurement of how countries are performing against these Sustainable Development Goals. And lo and behold, of course, our friends in the Nordic region have consistently all 5 years topped the list, number 1, number 2, number 3, most recently Denmark number 1, Sweden number 2, Finland number 3 in the world, the US typically in the 30 to 40 range there. But that is a measurement of comparative performance, because when it comes to issues of responsible consumption and production and climate action, all of the advanced economies, all the OECD countries have a ways to go, have much work to do. But I would suggest the approach that we see in the Nordics, a more cooperative, democratic approach, can provide us with inspiration for how to address these great challenges. Now, there is a long-standing debate in the business community about the purpose of business. And this is how I entered the phrase so many years ago as a business school student, was what is the purpose of business? And that Milton Friedman edict, the business of business is business, that has rung true for many, many years. And while we don't necessarily reference explicitly Milton Friedman in our corporate strategy, that's baked in, that self-interest mantra. Because we did learn Michael Porter. Michael Porter is the strategic management guru, father of competitive advantage. And very interestingly, Michael Porter recently, 2011, co-authored this article, Creating Shared Value. That was different language. It was a signal for very different approach to business that was not necessarily hyper-competitive. I welcome this shift, and I welcome, just a couple weeks ago, the Business Roundtable shift, saying we need a redefinition of the purpose of business. I welcome this and welcome the language. But I have to say, I'm a bit suspect of it. I'm a little suspicious. And I see because in an American context, we oftentimes push problems on the level of the individual, and perhaps the organization. And we're dealing with very systemic issues here. And so that question of can the private sector drive change? Yes, absolutely. But it won't drive the kind of systems change we need without good policy. And I would suggest that those of us in the business community and business school are much more engaged in policy discussions. And here, I look to the very nature of the structure of the publicly traded corporation that we should revisit in the US context. And prior to going the academic route, I spent a decade in industry. And one of those roles was in investor relations. And the incredible short-termism that was baked into the structure was so apparent. And we need to address this. So I'm going to bring us back to the Nordics here for my final point. Because they, of course, have publicly traded corporations in the Nordic region also. I'd like to draw some attention, global attention, to this concept of the Danish Industrial Foundation. A little-known secret that 70% of the Danish stock exchange is structured like this, publicly traded corporations like Novo Nordisk, like Carlsberg. AB share splits, those A shares stay in the hands of an industrial foundation in perpetuity. Very different time horizon when one talks to a CEO and CFO at a Danish firm like this. Other stock is still traded on the public market, so they still have to try to attract that capital There are those incentives there, but it allows for greater long-termism. So yes, I welcome the language of the Business Roundtable, that language shift, but I would suggest it needs to be coupled with new structures to support corporations whose purpose is for a broader group of stakeholders. Tak.
What an inspiring meeting. I just want to say how much I appreciate all the effort that went into planning this and getting everybody here together. And also maybe just to build on some of the remarks that have recently been made by Christine in the previous session and then just now by Robert. I couldn't agree more that, you know, the private sector can play a major positive role, but we utterly need good policy and to aim at driving system-wide deep change. And I am sure everybody here, I imagine, agrees strongly with that. And I really appreciate the opening that Alicia made. And I'll, just in the few minutes here, want to touch on a couple of things where I see tremendous opportunity to bring our community together ever more to help advance this systemic change. And that's in the context of valuing nature and nature's contribution, in particular here, to health and well-being in basically all decision-making. And we could say that there's a broad community that's been working on, there are a lot of ways it can be phrased, but driving open a pathway to inclusive green growth. And there are now many scalable demonstrations around the world of bringing science and sustainability into a lot of different sort of major investment contexts, like in development planning, in making cities more livable and sustainable, and specifically looking at climate resilience, securing fresh water, at the role of the private sector in setting and implementing standards and how these investments are made. But to go beyond this and to, I'd say a top frontier in this is to bring health more explicitly into what's been done so far. So I'm going to describe very briefly what's been done so far and then indicate a little bit of this opportunity in the couple of minutes I have. So up to now, there's been a contribution of well over 1,000 scientists directly and many, many more indirectly into building a sort of a universal language. This is partly led by IPBES, the sort of IPCC for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. So building a universal language and a framework for quantifying and bringing the science together, the delivery or the contribution of nature to many, many different dimensions of well-being, here just showing a few, all of which relate one way or another, and mostly quite directly to health. And as Alicia kindly said, this system has been codified into a software platform called Invest that's got global data, increasingly good and accessible, well-curated global data, though we need to go a lot further on that, and use at one level or another in most countries, and taken up whole hog in very fundamental ways in China, for example. And here's just a taste of what this software can do, and I know it's hard to read these little things. There's a paper coming out very soon led by one of the leaders of this whole effort, Bucky Chaplin-Kramer. But the idea is that at all scales, and now for the first time at the global scale, but also at very fine scales, we can model things like water quality regulation provided by ecosystems to reduce the flux of nitrates or phosphorus or sediment and other impurities in water. Same with coastal risk reduction to show where along coastlines, looking at what's happening in the Bahamas and elsewhere tragically just now, where along coastlines ecosystems are most vital for protecting property and communities. And then pollination, thinking of my friend here, Sam Myers, we focused on pollination as a contrasting service that provides many health benefits through human nutrition and providing the most nutritious of our crops. So you can zoom in then in all of this to any place and look, for example, at pollination services here in a layer laid over population exposed. Population, people that live more than, I think we said, 100 kilometers from areas where they're sort of good markets with very internationally traded sort of high nutrition, fresh foods. So that's just a taste of that. I know we're not able to get into it in detail now, but we see huge opportunity to integrate much more the health impacts of changes in the delivery of nature's contributions to people. And then what would these be used for? I'm going to touch on two examples. The first is, so remember I said there have been basically hundreds now of demonstrations worldwide of how to drive this kind of information system-wide into decision-making of, in some cases, corporations. More widely, it's development banks, it's governments, and communities at many different scales. And one opportunity that's just opened up and is partway down the track, but which we hope to sustain for a long time and integrate the health community into, is with the World Bank, and it's to build on Jim Kim's advancement of this human capital index and put forth a natural capital index. So we've got it underway. I don't think I have a pointer, but what you see there is the country of Ghana. Its current landscape is marked by that little dot, and that figure of the landscape hasn't come through. But anyway, then what this is basically is a production possibility frontier, looking at, if you remember your basic economics, looking at what a country could do with its natural capital assets, its living natural capital, land, in different forms, forests, in farmland, in coastal mangroves or coral reefs or what have you. How could it deploy its natural capital to achieve greater well-being? And here we're putting on the x-axis things that are traded in markets like agricultural products, and on the y, public goods, and looking at those trade-offs. So anyhow, this index is now going to be delivered for every country, and we're just kind of in a test phase developing it, and we'd love to bring health in more. We've got, very crudely, air and water pollution, pollination, and aspects of climate change so far. The second big arena I want to touch on, and these are just exemplary of many others, is one being led by China called gross ecosystem product. And the idea is to come up with a metric to sit next to gross domestic product in a huge array of decisions in China. But just to define it briefly, it's, just as the economy is a complex, massive set of goods and services whose values are integrated and presented in a very simple summary statistic and metric that's widely used, gross domestic product. We're aiming to do the same, to track all of the stocks of natural capital in the background, but then look at the production of value, the goods and services by ecosystems to society. Over on the right, things like flood protection, air and water purification, pollination, and mental health. And the way it works is through all kinds of sensing systems and data coming in, using this platform, the INVEST platform, to produce a understandable stream of value, nature's goods and services, that are then integrated into all kinds of decisions, so people know the contributions of ecosystems to the economy and society. And in China, they've arranged pretty massive transfers, so that now about 200 financial transfers, so that about 200 million people are being paid on a daily basis to restore ecosystems. Often the consuming regions or consuming populations of these ecosystem benefits, downstream, downwind, and otherwise often quite removed. making these investments through government policy, and then finally to evaluate the performance of policies and leaders. So those are just two examples of how, building on about 20 years of playing around in different contexts worldwide, we've built up a body of evidence for what works, and now trying to scale this, and really looking forward to engaging much more deeply with the health community. And just showing you here, another slide didn't quite come up, but anyway, this book that's coming out officially today with Island Press that summarizes a lot of the demonstrations. So thank you very much for that, and I look forward to a lot of great conversation.
Hi, good morning. My name is Ranjini. Thank you, Alicia, for the introduction, and thank you for having me here. It's a very inspiring session, and I completely agree. You know, private sector, yes, can drive change towards sustainability. We need changes at the policy level, yes. We need to bring sustainability to the Business Roundtable, as John mentioned. And hopefully the perspective that I can bring to the table is actually private sector can also drive market shifts to change public perception of what sustainability means. And it's not necessarily a foreign concept that needs to be imposed on people. So I work at Impossible Foods in research and development, and I'll tell you a little bit about Impossible. Perhaps some of you have heard about it. It's a sort of full circle for Impossible because it started by Pat Brown, who was a professor in biochemistry just a couple of buildings from here. So I'll start with probably a description that is not really needed for this audience, but we know that animal agriculture, especially industrialized animal farming, has a huge environmental impact, right? It's driving about, 50% of the ice-free land on the planet goes towards animal farming, more than a quarter of the freshwater resources. And it's one of the biggest contributors to greenhouse gas emissions. So this, clearly as the population in the world is increasing, as the demand for meat increases, this is not sustainable. We're just racing towards ecological disaster. So what can private sector do here? As the demand for meat increases, one of the things to consider is how does technology drive this change? So, for instance, since prehistoric times, our way of food production has stayed the same, really. We use animals as the primary vehicle for converting plant biomass into nutrient-dense foods. And is this really the way we can scale, given the ecological impact? Perhaps no. And if that seems like a very foreign concept, then, think about cars and transportation. So 100 years ago, horses were the way of, the fast transport, and then we got to faster horses. Eventually, cars came around. And why did people make the shift? This is the point I was trying to make in the beginning. People make the shift when you provide them with an alternative that will outperform what they need. So once cars started to outperform horses, people made the shift. So I'd like to propose that perhaps industry and private sector and a lot of university-based research can also help drive research in directions. And I think to the point that Gretchen was making, combine science and nature in a way that is helpful for all of us. So I think Pat founded the company in 2011. I was very fortunate to also start there about the same time. Great vision that one must be able to use biochemical tools to convert plants into meat, bypassing the need for animals. So it was founded with one, mission in mind, to reduce the biodiversity and climate change impact and transform the global food system to make delicious meats directly from plants and target meat eaters. So not make a veggie burger, not force people to have more tofu and beans or something like that, but actually provide a very viable, realistic alternative that'll outperform what they're used to. So that's the theme I'd like to bring out. Research and private sector can help catalyze that change. I'm gonna skip this slide. It's obviously a very, very big market, trillions of dollars of opportunity for the food industry. It's also at the intersection of climate change, food security, and animal welfare. So it's a sort of, personally for me, a very inspiring place to be. So we spend a lot of time, personally, I spend a lot of time in the research and development group to understand why meat behaves like meat, why does it taste like meat. We do a lot of work on that. We have patents on the use of hemoglobins for food to make the characteristic taste and color that people are used to. And this is, the first product is the Impossible Burger. And as Alicia said, you have Impossible Meatballs at the poster session today. So hopefully you have a chance to try and you can send us any comments. It's made entirely from plants, and the point for this audience is it's vastly more sustainable than the animal counterpart. So you're using 95% less water, up to 90% less land and greenhouse gas emissions. So yes, private sector can drive that change. And we're actually seeing that, real meat chefs will get behind our product. We are in about 15,000 restaurants today, and all of these restaurants are seeing increased, customer base as well. So that's the point about the market itself getting behind the product once the technology is there. So we also hope to expand internationally into many different countries, and ultimately create an entire array of animal products, including various types of dairy and fish. And I'm happy to take any questions, but I'll leave you with the thought that how private sector can use technology to its benefit and drive the sustainable change. Thank you.
So we're going to go from impossible to regenerative, which is not impossible. When Sam asked me to come, I got the sense he wanted me to give the rah-rah private sector finance is going to fix the problem spiel. And so I had to talk him out of that. If he wanted that spiel, he's getting the wrong guy. My story is I spent 20 years on Wall Street, kind of in the belly of the beast, and left in 2001. I always like to get that in there. 2001 came before 2008. And have been really on a deep search ever since, because I think the problem that we're wrestling with is far deeper and more profound than most of us outside of this room, and probably even some of us inside this room, have yet gotten their hands around. And of course, at the core of the problem is that we're destroying the planet because there's a profit in it. And the second piece of the problem is that while green growth is absolutely possible in individual situations, there's this pesky thing called the laws, not theories, of thermodynamics, which we know means that exponential growth on a finite planet forever can't happen indefinitely. That's the big elephant in the room, and it's actually worse than that, because our capitalist system, and by the way, the socialist system has got the same problem, is predicated on and capitalized on the idea of not just profit, but growing profits exponentially forever on a planet that has a growing population that's seeking higher and higher standards of living. So what that means as a practical matter is that we're flying in a plane very fast, and the valuation of the global economy is predicated on this exponential growth. And we all know what happens to the stock market when there's news that comes that says, oh, the growth rate's going to go down by 0.07%, and the stock market sells off. Well, what if the growth rate long-term can't be 2 to 3% in aggregate, but needs to be 1 to 2%? Or what about 0%? What that means is that the valuation of the global economy, which is private sector, public sector, our tax base, everything, is essentially built on a foundation of sand. And that valuation is, in my judgment, likely to come unglued sometime in the next 25 years. And what that means is we're going to need to deal with this transition to sustainability while we're facing profound economic distress. Because either we destroy the planet, either we keep doing what we're doing and we destroy the planet and face that distress, or we're going to have to come to grips with this idea that exponential growth for everything all at one time forever is unsustainable. And in 2011, I wrote a little paper on this when the Carbon Tracker report came out and estimated that the value of the financial assets in the oil and gas sector that needed to be written off was $20 trillion. And to put that into context, the subprime crisis direct loss was $2.3 trillion. So we've continued to invest in oil and gas since then, so the problem's only getting bigger. But we need to absorb, while we're doing our green growth, we need to absorb just from the oil and gas sector a $20 trillion loss. And if you want to know what that might look like, go to Venezuela today. So, having said that, there is tremendous things happening in the private sector. There's tremendous companies doing tremendous work. There's tremendous efforts around reporting and socially responsible investing, ESG investing, impact investing. Technology obviously is going to play a huge role in this, both big data and artificial intelligence, if properly used. You know, as a former derivatives expert, I'm pretty cynical and skeptical about humanity's track record in deploying technologies intelligently. We seem to think that we know more than we do, and there's always unintended consequences. With finance, that translated into the financial crash. With the kind of technology you folks around here are involved in, that translated into the Russians influencing our election and many other problems. But, you know, obviously technology, smart technology and artificial intelligence is going to need to be at the heart of our pathway forward. Even the kind of old guard, as Robert mentioned, the Business Roundtable, came out with a new statement in the purpose of the corporation. Now, what Robert didn't tell you is that the new statement on the purpose of a corporation looks an awful lot like the one that existed in the 1980s when these folks were in business school, probably around the corner from here. So in my professional career lifetime, we've gotten back to where we were in terms of the purpose of the corporation. So I'm not holding high hopes that that alone is going to suddenly shift the fundamental problem, is that we have a system where we can make a profit by destroying the planet, and we're predicating everything on exponential growth forever. Now, of course, all of this great work that's been happening in the private sector, that was the first slide, which I could have talked about for the whole talk, isn't working. And, you know, the carbon, CO2 in the atmosphere breaking 415 is just one indicator. You all are familiar with the 500 other indicators that tell the same story. So whatever we're doing isn't working, and we need to think differently about it. John Elkington, one of the leaders of sustainable finance last year, or sustainable business rather, last year, issued his term, product recall, on the term he coined 25 years ago, triple bottom line. Triple bottom line is essentially the idea of stakeholder capitalism. That's been around for 25 years, and last year in the Harvard Business Review, sorry, Stanford, he wrote a paper saying, it's not working, we need to rethink it. I'm happy to say he's moving into the Regeneration camp, but that's a talk for another day. Now, back to the Business Roundtable, Jamie Dimon, who is the chairman of the Business Roundtable, when he announced the Business Roundtable's new purpose of a corporation, he didn't tell you that I think it was the Rainforest Alliance, calculated that the global banks have financed $2 trillion of oil and gas fossil fuel investment since Paris, and that his bank, JP Morgan Chase, by the way, I used to work at JP Morgan, so this is personal. It was a very different firm then than it is today. But JP Morgan Chase, like many things, came out on top. And they were by far the largest lender to fossil fuel development since Paris. And you may wonder you probably recognize Jamie's face, but you probably don't recognize the older gentleman up in the corner. Does anyone recognize that face? We should recognize that face. That man is Lee Raymond. He was the CEO of Exxon through the 80s and 90s, who was responsible for funding climate denial. Guess why I have him on this page? He is the lead director of JP Morgan today. He's Jamie Dimon's boss, if there is such a thing. So, on to the good news. Now, that's not a nice slide, but I don't mean it to be unkind. The truth is, one of the most optimistic things I can say is the old guard is dying off. And there's a rise in consciousness in the next generation that is somehow better in tune to the indigenous wisdom that we heard about earlier, and is going to approach things in a different way. And this man, who's next-gen Coke, look at his shoulders. Look at the burden that's been placed on those shoulders. They're sagging, and I feel for that man. So what do? In my opinion, we don't really have the answers yet. The science has the answers, but in economics, we just awarded the Nobel Prize to someone who said that the optimal global warming we should seek to aim to is 4.5 degrees, because anything less would be too expensive. That's true. So in economics, we fundamentally need to rethink how we understand how economics can possibly work on a finite planet. And so for me, it's been kind of going back to school and rethinking fundamentals and theory. And that's why I've landed on this idea of regeneration. Regeneration is simply the process through which all living systems stay sustainable over a long period of time. They happen to be marvelously aligned with the wisdom traditions that have stood the test of time. So my sort of simple idea is either we figure out how to organize our human economy in alignment with these universal patterns and principles, or we're going to crash, and we're going to restart the human experiment from a lower level of complexity. A nice visual way to see this, I borrow from Bill Reed at Regeneration. Sustainability is not the goal. Sustainability is the outcome. What we need to do is move from a degenerative system, which is where we are on the left in the brown, to a regenerative system on the right in the green, which means we need to move into alignment with living systems design and the wisdom traditions that we know we just have forgotten. That involves holistic thinking, not reductionist thinking. You all know the university, the academy is locked in a reductionist structure. That makes it very difficult. I suspect there's no one here other than Robert from a business school. Anyone here from a business school? 1, 2, better than normal. All of this science and research gets done in the academy, and the business school on the hill, which is usually the shiny building, is not involved. We need the business schools in these conversations. We don't need to make ecology business friendly. We need to make business ecology friendly. These are, I don't have time to go through these, but in my paper, which is at capitalinstitute.org, I talk about 8 principles. Any of you trained in ecology will recognize these, but my view is we need to get back to first principles and begin to think about our economic system and economic development around those. And the way we're putting this into practice in the real world is to follow the principles. There's nothing in the principles that says anything about a multinational corporation or a nation state. But one of the principles is honors community and place. And we've heard earlier today lots of positive energy and traction happening when we move this work to the community level. So we've organized a network of place-based places where human culture and geologic reality come together. And we've, I even say we've simply opened the opportunity for these initiatives to connect and begin learning together. So we've created a network for this co-creation to happen. We attract these centers of activity, we nourish them through support from the center. We need to develop new measures of regenerative health, just like you go to the doctor and they test your blood pressure, not because you care about your blood pressure, but because you know your blood pressure is an indicator of regenerative health. We need to connect through a network, as I said, and then illuminate this new regenerative model going forward. There is a presidential candidate who lives not far from here who's talking about regenerative economics on the campaign trail. I hope he has a chance to get it into the debates so that conversation moves more broadly, but there's signs of progress. And finally, I'll leave you with a Bucky Fuller quote. Bucky was, his last book written, it was published the year he died in the 1980s. And I only recently read this like a year ago, so you can imagine my surprise and good feeling when I learned that he was totally onto this regenerative idea. And I'll just close by reading this. When individuals shunt the comprehensive cosmic regeneration into exclusive advantaging of only their own survival and enjoyment, that's what we're doing, and succeed in the short-circuiting of prolonged cosmic regenerativity, that's what we're doing, they disqualify the invention human as a reliable function of regenerative universe. So the regenerative idea actually is real from the cellular level to the cosmic level. And all we need to do is figure out how to get back into alignment with it. Easier said than done. Thank you.
Wow, those were great presentations. I sure, like you, I just learned a whole lot. And we have limited time for questions. I'm going to take my moderator's prerogative and ask the first couple, and hopefully we'll have time to get to the audience as well. I want to start actually with a question that's really directed at both Robert and John, picking up on the first and last presentations, which is to say, if you were to wake up tomorrow as either the head of the SEC or chair of the Federal Reserve Board, what would you do to affect the type of change you just presented?
John?
I got to talk too much. Yeah. So if I was the head of the SEC, I would probably shoot myself. But if I was, is this working? Can you all hear me?
I think they heard that. The laughter, I think, is...
That's off the record.
Yeah.
But if I was the head of the Federal Reserve, I would say, we just printed $13 trillion to save the global economy, and everyone said the world would end, and the world didn't end. So we certainly have the capacity to print another 13 trillion if we need to, and maybe another 100 trillion. But we have to stop talking about this thing as if we can't afford it. We can afford this. We need the willpower and the drive to afford it, and we need to rethink monetary policy to understand that at this crisis point in time, the only viable pathway to mobilize $2 trillion a year for the next 25 years into the transition of the energy system alone, let alone everything else we need, is to marshal the power of our ability to print money. Now, if you're interested in that idea, go to modern monetary theory. I'm not crazy. This is a well thought out and understood concept.
Robert, you want to add anything to that?
I would also suggest that as head of the SEC, I would take a hard look at a thing called SASB, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, which is a play on FASB, the Financial Accounting Standards Board. And SASB has done a remarkably good job in building consensus around what are the most material sustainability issues across 79 industries that are currently not reported. as a matter of financial disclosure. And markets don't work when they don't have the information. And so this won't solve, this is no silver bullet, but it steps us toward having firms like oil companies, et cetera, having to report. And then investors, and increasingly investors, are demonstrating a desire for ESG, although I would suggest it's much smaller than what some of the numbers suggest, but we need that information there in order to even drive the markets there. So SASB, and it's right up here in San Francisco.
Great, thank you. Okay, I want to get two more questions in, one for each Ranjini and Gretchen. Ranjini, I wanted to ask you, you mentioned, the meat industry is a $1 trillion market, as we've seen, particularly in the energy sector, when you threaten big markets with big incumbents, they have opinions about that. So what has your experience been in disrupting the meat industry? How have the incumbent players responded? I've seen stories about whether you can call your burger a burger, those sorts of things. And if not the incumbents, what's been your biggest barrier to growth?
I guess there's many questions in that one, but impossible, and I think that it's true even personally, I wouldn't consider the meat industry as sort of opposed to us. I think we don't want to make people feel bad for the choices they make. People who eat meat because it's a dense source of nutrients. It's a very good source of protein. It's affordable, something they're familiar with. There's a lot of cultural connotation with food. So the approach we've taken is to provide, really such a experience that mimics what they experience when people eat meat, so that people will make the choice. They have an alternative. They can think about the choice they're making, and in fact, feel good about the choice they're making. So, for example, someone who drives a regular gas car does not have to, you shouldn't make them feel bad. I'm sure they have their own reasons. But if, in fact, they are able to switch to an electric car, maybe they feel better about making that choice. So that's sort of one aspect to it. I think there are states that are proposing that plant-based meat not be called plant-based meat, or sorry, not be called meat. That is a barrier. But it only makes our job more difficult, because ultimately, it doesn't matter what you call it. People will eat what they like. So the approach we've taken, again, is to provide the good alternative and let the market make the choice.
Sense. Okay, Gretchen, question I want to ask you, and then I'm turning to you, audience. We all watched in horror over the last few weeks as the Amazon has been burning at scale and scope, unprecedented levels. How does this concept of GEP and the tools that you've developed apply in that case? And are you working with the Brazilian government, or how, is this a case study where the work that you're doing could have resulted in a different outcome? Or change the outcome?
That's a really good and devastating example to bring up. Certainly the destruction of the Amazon today is driven by a number of political forces that are operating broadly around the world now, with a complexity behind them that I don't pretend could be solved by one other way of looking at things. But at the same time, I do feel that to drive the fundamental cultural shift and kind of social, moral shift that we're all talking about in a way that's feasible, we have to somehow embed into the systems that dominate how decisions are made today. We need to embed the kind of knowledge that is held in places like this, but is so inaccessible to most people. And that's why I focused, it might sound very Silicon Valley-like or something, when I have an aversion to a lot of things Silicon Valley-like, but on this platform, because that is where we are. It's the 21st century. In a way, it's a mechanism, an instrument for driving a cultural shift, where on the one hand, we could have the Pope with Laudato Si, and the Dalai Lama, and many other types of leadership and trying to change thinking, but that will only go so far. This other approach is certainly something that is doable worldwide, and that we're just on the cusp of seeing that happen. And in terms of working in Brazil, you know, what's happening now makes you ever more worried about how we're getting to different points of no return. But the whole intent is to build capacity and make this a global movement. And there's a lot I don't have time to get into, but would love to talk later about with people in doing so. In Brazil, across Latin America, the Inter-American Development Bank, for example, has adopted all of this approach across all of the countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, and they're a major investor. So it's a way of penetrating the heart of the system with the science and the intention, the human intention, looking into the future of achieving planetary health.
Thank you. So we're getting right up close to lunch, maybe one or two audience questions, and hopefully folks can stick around too if more people have questions afterwards. Yes, right here in the front.
Hi. Just wanted to say thanks to the presenters.
You can be next. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, sorry.
No. We'll get the two of you. Go ahead.
Gotcha. And I wanted to point out what John had talked about, and I really appreciate that, because one of the concerns that we have as Indigenous people is that our social and environmental challenges that we face today are often the consciousness that form those problems are the same consciousness that are being applied to the solutions today. So it's the first time I've ever heard in a Western discourse a change of consciousness in your talk today, John, so I appreciate that. And, I hope that all of us think, because most people in this room were raised in a certain consciousness that created these problems, that if you're not having internal conflicts in the process of finding solutions, then probably those are not the right solutions. So I applaud you in that discussion and bringing that forward today, because it's not an easy discussion, but as Indigenous people, we really are molded with your words today and how you presented. Masicho, thank you.
Thank you. So, yeah, you have the mic. Yeah, great.
Hi. I love the presentations today. Thank you for your time and your wisdom. I have a question about scale, and particularly when thinking regeneratively. So sort of, perhaps, John, your presentation and Gretchen spoke most closely to this. I'm someone who's not averse to scale. I worked at Apple for 8 years and helped scale the iPhone and iPad business, and come from a business school and MIT and whatever. But I left Silicon Valley 3 years ago and have spent the last 3 years living in rural Indian communities, largely Indigenous communities, 3 different ones, living regeneratively, studying how my ancestors lived, and also studying our ancestral healing systems, all of which were intertwined with life. As I come back and start my own startup on this space, allowing us to live regeneratively in America, the biggest paradox for me is about scale and how I think about that. So I'd love to hear your thoughts to us as an audience. How do we think about living regeneratively, and whether we need to do that, or what type of scale we need to do that in? I know that it's quite a topic, and I'd love to hear your insights.
Sure. Well, thanks. That's a great, hard question. Thanks for raising it. And maybe we'd chat over lunch. But so quick response is that follow the principles. Follow how living systems scale. And they don't scale up, they scale out. They replicate, which is why the network is the metaphor, not the machine, which was the metaphor of the industrial economy. And so, think of 1,000 place-based regenerative initiatives connected and learning together, as opposed to a policy that a nation state imposes from the top down. Now, thank goodness China is trying to impose policies from the top down, because it works for a while. And on that kind of a scale, I can't imagine any other way. But long term, I think we need to, get clear on first principles, and then trust them and invest in them and follow them. And for companies, it's even a harder question, because a global corporation, what does Apple do? Well, I would say what Apple does is needs to first understand that it's a participant in a series of place-based regenerative communities, and show up and contribute as a member of a community as opposed to figuring out how to optimize paying no taxes.
We are at time. I don't want to, oh, sorry. One more question that person's got the mic, and then we'll go to lunch and we can continue the
For
conversation.
your engaging presentations. A quick question for the private sector. Where does the gig economy fall within your vision of sustainability?
Just very quickly, with respect to gig economy, this is where we see some of the real fissures and challenges in the American version of capitalism. Because now we're pushing more burden on individuals to put in place basically all of the health care and all these sorts of things, education, et cetera, and why I draw inspiration from a Nordic variety of capitalism, where they've figured out where there are certain areas that the private sector market should be playing, and where there are areas where it's actually inefficient at a scale of a country. And so things like figuring out how do we actually have really equitable and good quality healthcare, education, these sorts of things, so folks could actually participate if it made sense in the gig economy in Denmark, for example, because if that job goes away, they don't lose their home, they don't lose their health insurance and all these things. And so I see just this, for some reason, we're in the land of the plenty here, but we operate in survival mode. And I don't know about you all, but I would have a hunch that you're like me. I'm at my worst when I'm in survival mode, when I'm worried about money, when I'm worried about time, and I'm the worst parent when I'm like that. And so I would suggest that the gig economy just exasperates the challenges and problems that we have with American capitalism. And why I would challenge us all, very much including those of us in the business community, to look outside the walls of the United States and are what we envision of American capitalism for inspiration. And maybe to look back in time and look at different cultures, because American capitalism is not working the way that we need it to work.
All right. Well, with that, please join me in thanking our panelists.